The WA thought they could bully me with a petty fine. All I did was cast a fishing line into the lake I'd been walking past for years, enjoying a peaceful Saturday. But no, within 24 hours, a neon orange slip was taped to my door demanding $500 for illegal fishing. Illegal, on the water right behind my own home. That was the spark. If they wanted war, I was ready to serve it cold, one fishing rod at a time. So, I did something they never saw coming. I bought the whole lake, and banned the entire neighborhood. It started on what should have been the most peaceful Saturday I'd had in months. The kind of morning where the air feels lighter, the breeze carries just enough coolness to remind you the world isn't always out to get you, and the lake behind our neighborhood shimmered like a sheet of glass sprinkled with diamonds. I'd been staring at that lake for years, walking past it, waving at the ducks, watching kids throw rocks into it, always thinking it was ridiculous that no one ever seemed to enjoy it properly. I mean, a lake is a lake. Water exists to be lived with, to be fished, to be swum in, to be something other than an ornament in the HOA's over-manicured crown. That morning, with coffee still buzzing in my veins and a fishing rod leaning in the corner of my garage, I thought, why not? So I grabbed the rod, threw a couple of worms in a bucket, and headed down to the water's edge like a man on a mission. There was something almost rebellious about it, though it didn't feel like rebellion then. It felt like freedom. Casting that first line across the glistening surface was like reclaiming a piece of sanity I hadn't realized the WA had been draining from me. Every tug on the rod, every ripple on the water, it was mine. For half an hour, I was 10 years old again, fishing with my granddad, listening to the water lap against the shore, losing myself in patience and quiet. Until the quiet shattered. I didn't even see her approach at first. The sharp voice came before the shadow. "Excuse me, sir. What exactly do you think you're doing?" It was Margaret. Of course it was Margaret, the president of the HOA, a woman who treated our cul-de-sac like her personal kingdom and wore her authority like an iron crown. She was flanked by 2 other board members, all of them with clipboards like medieval guards holding spears. I turned around slowly, rod in hand, pretending not to notice the way my stomach sank. "I'm fishing," I said, as plainly as if I had announced the sky was blue. Her eyes narrowed behind oversized sunglasses. "This is a common area. Fishing is prohibited. It's clearly stated in the covenant." I looked around. The covenant? Did she think I carried that 1,000-page monstrosity in my back pocket for light reading? I shrugged. Didn't see a sign. Didn't think I needed one. She sniffed like I'd insulted her entire lineage. "You will be receiving a fine. Consider this a violation of WA policy." It was laughable. A fine? For fishing? In water that literally touched my backyard? I almost chuckled right there, but her serious expression and the scratching of a clipboard pen reminded me these people weren't joking. They never joked. I reeled in my line, tucked the rod under my arm, and walked back up the path without another word. But inside, something was brewing, something sharp and restless, like a splinter lodged under my skin. The next morning, I found it. Bright neon orange, taped to my front door as if they wanted the entire block to see it. "Violation notice," it screamed in all caps, followed by a description of my so-called crime, unauthorized fishing in HOA-managed lake. Fine. $500. Immediate payment required. $500. For dipping a line into water. For doing something people in normal towns. Paid $10 for at a bait shop. I stood there on my porch, the paper crinkling in my hand, my coffee going cold. $500 wasn't just petty, it was tyrannical. My mind raced through everything I knew about this WA, how they sent letters if your trash bins were visible for more than 5 minutes after pickup, how they measured grass height with rulers like it was sacred scripture, how they fined my neighbor $50 for planting petunias that were off-palette from the approved colors. This wasn't about fishing. This was about control, about Margaret and her little army of clipboard crusaders proving that their power extended to every square inch of our lives. At first, the anger came slow, like water starting to boil. I thought, maybe I'll just pay it. Maybe it's not worth the trouble. But the more I stared at that orange slip, the more absurd it became. Pay them $500 for what? For daring to touch a lake. For enjoying the one patch of nature in this sterilized neighborhood of cookie-cutter houses and manicured lawns. It wasn't the money, it was the principle. By lunchtime, the anger had burned into disbelief. I sat at the kitchen table, the violation slip spread out in front of me, muttering to myself like a lunatic. Illegal fishing, who even says that? What are they going to do next? Fine me for breathing HOA-approved oxygen. For walking on the grass without a permit. My dog tilted his head like he was trying to follow my rant, but even he seemed to know it was nonsense. By evening, disbelief had calcified into something else. Stubbornness. The kind that dug its heels in, clenched its fists, and started plotting. The kind that said, "You picked the wrong guy." I replayed Margaret's smug tone in my head, the way she wielded her authority like a club, and it lit a fire in me. They wanted obedience. They wanted me to cough up $500 like a good little homeowner and lick their boots in gratitude. Well, I wasn't built for boot licking. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling fan spinning in slow, hypnotic circles, my mind chewing on the injustice like a dog with a bone. I thought about every neighbor they'd harassed into submission, every ridiculous rule they'd invented to justify their fees, every ounce of joy they'd stolen in the name of community standards. And I thought about that lake. That shimmering piece of water that sat there like a jewel in the middle of our neighborhood, untouched, unused, guarded like a treasure chest by people who saw it only as leverage. And that was the moment it clicked. The fine wasn't just about fishing. It wasn't even about me. It was about the constant reminder that in this neighborhood, we weren't homeowners, we were subjects. Subjects to an HOA that thought it could rule by decree, as if this cul-de-sac were their kingdom. So I made a vow, lying there in the darkness, the violation slip still burning in my head. If they wanted a fight, they'd get one. Not the kind of fight they expected, with appeals or letters or polite disagreements. No, I was done playing by their rules. I would find my own way to strike back, my own way to show them they couldn't push me around. I didn't know how yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. By the time Monday rolled around, I'd almost convinced myself to let it go. Almost. I told myself, it's just $500, pay the stupid fine and get back to living. That's what the wall wanted, for me to fold like everyone else had. But something inside me just wouldn't snap the way they wanted. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. And if you think I was going to let Margaret, the self-appointed queen of our neighborhood, win this round, you'd be dead wrong. I didn't have to wait long to face her again. The HOA held its monthly meeting that Monday evening in the community clubhouse, a beige, lifeless little building they called the heart of the neighborhood. I called it the dungeon, because nothing good ever came out of there. I walked in and immediately felt like a wolf stepping into a henhouse. Every head turned. Some people avoided my gaze, others offered pitying looks, and a few gave me subtle nods like they were rooting for me but didn't dare make it public. And then there she was. Margaret, seated at the head of the long folding table like a monarch on a plastic throne, flanked by her board members, Jim, the retired accountant who loved rules more than he loved breathing, and Linda, who smiled like a kindergarten teacher but wielded fines like a whip. They all had their clipboards, their binders, their stack of violation slips ready like ammunition. "Mr. Daniels," Margaret said, her voice syrupy and smug at the same time. "I see you've received your notice." I walked to the center of the room, violation slip in hand, and held it up. "Oh, I received it. Hard to miss when it's stapled to your door like a scarlet letter." A couple of neighbors snickered quietly. Margaret's lips tightened. "This is not a joke," she snapped. "You violated Section 14B of the Covenant, no fishing in the common areas. The fine is non-negotiable." I let the slip flutter to the table in front of her. "Tell me, Margaret, when was the last time you even walked by that lake?" "Because I live next to it. I see it every day. And I don't see signs that say no fishing. I don't see fences. I see a lake, collecting algae, going unused, because you and your little board think nature should be ornamental." A murmur rippled through the room. Some neighbors nodded, others looked terrified that I was poking the bear. Margaret leaned forward, her pearl earring swinging, eyes flashing like she'd just been challenged to a duel. "The covenant is clear," she hissed. "If you wanted to fish, you should have requested approval from the board." I couldn't help it, I laughed. "Approval? For fishing? Should I submit a form in triplicate every time I want to breathe the air by the lake? Maybe you should start fining us for clouds that don't meet your community standards." That earned a louder chuckle from the back. Margaret's face turned the color of an overripe tomato. Jim cleared his throat, trying to restore order. "Rules are rules, Mr. Daniels. If we let one person fish, then everyone will think they can fish. And God forbid we have people actually enjoying the neighborhood they pay thousands of dollars a year to live in," I shot back. Linda's fake smile faltered for the first time. She whispered something to Margaret, who gave a tight nod. Then Margaret spoke again, louder this time, like she wanted to remind the room of her authority. If you refuse to pay this fine, we will escalate the matter. Liens against your property, court involvement, we have the authority. And we will use it. Her words hung in the air like a guillotine. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. That was the HOA's real power, fear. Not the fines themselves, but the threat that if you resisted, they could strangle your life one paper cut at a time. I looked around the room, at the people who lived just feet from me, people who had smiled at block parties, borrowed sugar, waved from across driveways. And yet here they sat, silent, cowed by Margaret's little empire. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every neighbor who'd swallowed their pride and written a check just to avoid the hassle. So I leaned in, meeting Margaret's glare with a calm smile. Do what you have to do. But I'm not paying you a dime for fishing in a lake you don't even own. That word, own, made her flinch. Just a little, but I caught it. Something shifted behind her eyes, something she didn't want anyone else to see. That was when it hit me. Maybe, just maybe, this lake wasn't as untouchable as she wanted us to believe. The meeting wrapped up in chaos. Margaret slammed her gavel like she was presiding over the Supreme Court, declaring the matter, pending escalation. Neighbors filed out in uneasy silence. A few of them gave me small smiles, a couple even whispered, "Good for you," but most just hurried past, afraid to be seen taking sides. As I stepped outside into the humid night air, one of the older residents, Mr. Thompson, shuffled up beside me. He was a wiry man with weathered skin and eyes that had seen too many HOA meetings to care anymore. He leaned close and muttered, "You're not wrong. They've been bleeding us dry for years. Just be careful. Margaret doesn't like to lose." I nodded. Neither do I. Walking home, I replayed every moment of that confrontation in my head. The way Margaret's smile slipped when I said own. The way Jim stammered like he was reading from a script. The way the neighbor's eyes flickered with something between fear and hope. That was when the seed planted itself. Maybe the lake wasn't just a battlefield. Maybe it was the key. I didn't know how yet. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity as I unlocked my front door and crumpled the violation slip into the trash. The HOA thought they'd just scared me into submission. They had no idea they'd woken something else entirely. They hadn't just fined me for fishing. They'd declared war. The next few days were strange. On the surface, life went on as usual, morning coffee, mowing the lawn, waving at neighbors who were too polite to bring up the HOA drama, but underneath, there was a quiet electricity humming through me. Margaret thought she'd cornered me. She thought that little slip of paper on my door was the final word. But every time I looked at the lake shimmering in the sun, I felt something else, possibility. It gnawed at me, that word I'd thrown out during the meeting, own. It had slipped off my tongue like a joke, but Margaret's reaction hadn't been funny at all. She had flinched, a fraction of a second, but real. It was like I'd touched a nerve. And nerves only hurt when they're close to the bone. What if the HOA didn't actually own the lake? What if all their pomp and ceremony, all their fines and rules, were smoke and mirrors? The thought hooked me like the biggest fish I'd never caught. I couldn't shake it. That night, while the rest of the neighborhood slept under HOA-approved porch lights, I sat at my computer, digging. Property records, county databases, anything I could get my hands on. I didn't really know what I was looking for at first, but I knew one thing. If the HOA didn't own the lake, someone else did. And if someone else did, maybe they could sell it. The more I clicked, the deeper the rabbit hole went. Hours blurred together. The HOA's website bragged about managing the lake but never once used the word own. Interesting. County tax records were clearer. The lake wasn't listed under the HOA's name. Instead, it belonged to an LLC with some generic title like Clearwater Land Holdings. The address on the record was a P.O. box in another county. My pulse quickened. The HOA had been bluffing. They weren't the kings and queens of the lake, they were tenants, just like the rest of us. The next day, I drove down to the county records office, a beige building that smelled like dust and bureaucracy. After some sweet talking and a couple of annoyed sighs from the clerk, I got my hands on more detailed records. Clearwater Land Holdings was a shell company, but the actual deed traced back to an old family farm that predated the subdivision. The owner, a man named Henry Walker, 78 years old, lived about 30 minutes out of town. Now, I don't know if you believe in fate, but at that moment, it felt like the universe had handed me a loaded fishing rod and pointed straight at the biggest catch of my life. The WA thought they had me on a leash, but here was proof the leash wasn't even theirs. And if Henry Walker was still around, maybe he was tired of holding on to land he didn't need. I spent the drive to his place rehearsing what I'd say. I couldn't just show up and shout, "Sell me your lake." I had to be smart, polite, persuasive. I pictured him as a grizzled old farmer with a shotgun by the door, suspicious of strangers. What if he hated developers? What if he wanted to pass the land on to his kids? My stomach churned, but underneath the nerves was excitement, the kind of excitement you get when you realize the enemy has left the back door wide open. Henry Walker turned out to be exactly the kind of man you'd expect to own a lake: leathery skin, hands like tree bark, a cap pulled low over his brow. His farmhouse sat on a wide patch of land dotted with rusting tractors and barns that looked older than time. When I knocked, he opened the door slowly, eyes narrowing at me like he was measuring whether I was worth his breath. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice gravelly. "Yes, sir," I said, suddenly aware that my rehearsed speech had fled the second I saw him. "My name's Daniel, and I live in Lakeside Estates. You own some land there, the lake." His eyes lit with faint recognition. "That pond, to us, it's more than a pond," I said quickly. "The HOA's been, well, managing it. But I was wondering if you've ever thought about selling." He leaned against the doorframe, studying me. "That pond's been more trouble than it's worth. HOA's been a pain, always calling about weeds, about upkeep. I don't even live there anymore. Taxes are the only reason I haven't sold." My heart kicked against my ribs. This was it. This was the crack in the dam. "If you're serious, I'd like to buy it," I said. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Just stared at me like he was trying to decide if I was crazy. Maybe I was. Who buys a lake just to spite an HOA? But finally, he said, "Cash talks. You bring me a fair offer, we'll see." I drove home buzzing like I'd swallowed a beehive. The deal wasn't done, not even close, but the door was open. Wide open, and the thought of Margaret's face when she realized she'd been policing a lake she didn't even own, when she realized I owned it, was enough to make me laugh out loud alone in my car like a lunatic. The rest of that week, I did two things. I researched lake ownership laws until my brain felt like legal spaghetti, and I daydreamed about revenge. Did you know that if you own the land beneath a body of water, you can control access to it? That common area the WA loved to lord over wasn't common at all, it was private property. Whoever owned it set the rules. I pictured myself putting up a giant sign, "No WA allowed." I pictured Margaret sputtering into her morning coffee when she got the letter barring her from the water she thought was hers to command. But underneath the humor was strategy. This wasn't just about me catching fish in peace. This was about leverage. For years, the WA had been dictating what we could plant, how we could decorate, what shade of beige our houses had to be. They'd bullied us with threats of fines and liens. But if I owned the lake, I'd be the one holding the crown jewel of the neighborhood. And once that happened, Margaret's kingdom would crumble. The neighbors didn't know what I was plotting yet, but whispers had already started. At the mailbox, people would glance around nervously before muttering, "Heard you gave Margaret a run for her money." Or, "Good for you, standing up to them." It was always quiet, always private. Nobody dared challenge the WA publicly. That only made me more determined. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore, I was fighting for all of us who'd been too scared to push back. Late one night, as I stood at my window staring at the moonlit water, I realized something. This wasn't just revenge, this was destiny. The WA thought they had power, but power is only real if people believe in it. Once I owned the lake, once I shattered that illusion, they'd never look at Margaret the same way again. And so, with stubborn resolve hardening in my chest, I whispered to myself, "Find me for fishing. You'll regret that, Margaret. Because the next time I cast a line, it'll be in my lake." The big idea wasn't just born, it was alive, thrashing like a hooked fish, dragging me toward the fight of my life. The hardest part of chasing a big idea isn't the idea itself, it's the waiting. Once I knew the lake could be mine, patience turned into torture. Every time I walked past it, I saw it differently. It wasn't just water anymore. It was freedom, it was revenge, it was a giant middle finger aimed squarely at Margaret and her army of clipboards. But I couldn't exactly just show up with a fistful of cash and say, "Here, let me buy your pond." No, there were steps, paperwork, negotiations. all of which moved at the speed of a dying snail. I started with the bank. Sitting in a cramped office with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, I explained my plan to a lone officer named Greg, who had the charisma of a bowl of cold oatmeal. He peered at me over his glasses, unimpressed. "You want to buy a lake?" "Yes," I said firmly. "What for?" "Development, investment, fishing," I answered. His pen froze mid-scribble. I could practically hear the thought forming in his head, "This man has lost his mind." But then I added, "And control. It's the centerpiece of the neighborhood. Whoever owns it holds the cards." That part made him perk up. Banks love the word control. By the time I walked out of there, I had conditional approval for a loan that could cover the purchase. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't reckless either. If I pulled this off, it wouldn't just be satisfying, it would be strategic. Meanwhile, the HOA's shadow hung over everything. Margaret had escalated my violation. I got another notice in the mail, threatening liens and legal action if I didn't pay the fine. They wanted me scared. Instead, it only made me hungrier. Every threatening letter they sent was fuel for the fire. And I couldn't help laughing to myself. If things went my way, in just a few weeks, all their threats would bounce off me like rubber bullets. The next time I met Henry Walker, the farmer who technically still owned the lake, I brought coffee and donuts as a peace offering. He eyed them suspiciously, but eventually took a glazed one and muttered, "Haven't had a Krispy Kreme in years." Progress. We sat at his worn kitchen table, sunlight spilling across stacks of old bills and yellowing newspapers. He was a man who'd lived life simply and didn't care much for modern nonsense. "Why you want this lake so bad?" he asked between bites. I leaned forward, choosing my words carefully. "Because it matters to me. And because the HOA has been treating it like their property, even though it isn't. I'm tired of bullies running the show. If I own the lake, they can't push people around anymore." He grunted. "HOA's been a thorn in my side too. Always complaining, telling me I gotta spray weeds or fix erosion. Like they know more about land than I do. Truth is, I've been thinking about getting rid of it for years. Just never had anyone interested." That was music to my ears. I forced myself not to grin like a lunatic. "So what would it take for you to part with it?" Henry named a number that made my throat tighten. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't impossible either. It was within striking distance, just enough to scare me, but not enough to stop me. We shook hands, and for the first time, the lake felt less like a dream and more like a prize dangling just out of reach. From there, everything moved in slow, agonizing increments. Lawyers got involved. Papers had to be drafted. Titles had to be verified. Every phone call, every email, every trip to Henry's farm chipped away at the wall between me and ownership. And with every step forward, the wah grew louder. They must have sensed something was brewing, because suddenly Margaret was everywhere. I'd see her marching around the neighborhood like a general inspecting her troops, clipboard clutched to her chest, barking at people about overgrown hedges or mailbox paint. She even stopped me one afternoon as I was unloading groceries. "Have you thought about resolving your violation?" she asked sweetly, which in Margaret language meant, "I'd love nothing more than to crush you under my heel." "Oh, I've been thinking about it," I said with a smile. "Don't worry, Margaret, resolution is coming." The look on her face was priceless, confused, suspicious, but not yet afraid. That would come later. Finally, after what felt like years but was really just a few weeks, the day arrived. I drove to a law office downtown, sweaty palms gripping the steering wheel. My lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Carla, met me in the lobby with a reassuring smile. Ready to own a lake. Inside the conference room, Henry sat at the far end of the table, his cap pulled low, his expression unreadable. A stack of papers sat in the center like a treasure chest waiting to be unlocked. The pen lay on top, simple, ordinary, but heavy with meaning. We went through the paperwork line by line. Every signature was a drumbeat. Every initial was another nail in the coffin of Margaret's reign. My heart raced as I signed, page after page, until finally, Carla slid the last document in front of me. "This is it," she said softly. I picked up the pen. My hand shook, not with fear, but with adrenaline. I thought about that first fine taped to my door. I thought about Margaret's smug face at the meeting. I thought about every ridiculous rule, every unfair fee, every neighbor too scared to fight back. And then I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with a flourish. It was done. The lake was mine. The room seemed to exhale. Henry nodded, satisfied. "Good riddance," he muttered, standing up. "Never did like dealing with those WA folks anyway. It's your headache now. But to me, it wasn't a headache. It was a crown. On the drive home, I couldn't stop grinning. Every house I passed, every perfectly trimmed hedge and uniform mailbox, looked different now. The HOA thought they ruled the neighborhood, but they were about to learn the truth. They might control the lawns and the fences, but I controlled the heart, the lake. And soon, everyone would know it. I parked by my house, stepped out, and walked down to the water's edge. The sun was setting, painting the surface in gold and fire. For years, this lake had been the HOA's symbol of power. Now, it was mine. I crouched down, touched the cool water with my fingertips, and whispered, "Welcome home." For the first time since the fight began, I felt at peace. Not because the battle was over, but because it was about to begin in earnest. And this time, I wasn't the underdog anymore. I was the man who owned the battlefield. The funny thing about power is that it doesn't really exist until people see it. Owning the lake on paper was one thing, but the HOA didn't know yet. To them, I was still just the stubborn troublemaker who refused to pay a fishing fine. And that was exactly how I wanted it, for now. Because timing matters in war, and this was war, no doubt about it. The first week after the papers were signed, I walked around the neighborhood with a secret burning in my chest like a hidden flame. I smiled when I passed Margaret pruning her roses with military precision. I waved cheerfully at Jim, who frowned like I'd personally offended his calculator. And when Linda gave me her usual sugary greeting at the mailbox, I just grinned, thinking, "You have no idea the ground has already shifted under your feet." But eventually, the secret was too heavy to keep. Revenge, after all, is best served with witnesses. So when the notice for the next HOA meeting arrived in my mailbox, I knew it was time. The night of the meeting, I walked into the clubhouse calm and collected, dressed sharper than usual just to set the tone. The room buzzed with low conversation, neighbors whispering about fines, landscaping disputes, and whatever new nonsense the board had cooked up. A few gave me cautious nods. Word had gotten around that I hadn't paid the fishing fine, and some probably thought I was insane. Others, though, they looked at me with curiosity, like they were waiting for something. Margaret, as always, sat at the head of the table, pearls gleaming, lips pursed, eyes sharp. She banged her little wooden gavel and called the meeting to order. "We'll begin with violations," she said, flipping through her binder. "Mr. Daniels has yet to pay his outstanding fine. As a result, the board has voted to proceed with escalation." "Actually," I interrupted, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. "We need to talk about the lake." That got their attention. The whispers started immediately. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "The lake is not on the agenda." "Maybe not for you," I said, "but it's very much on mine." I reached into my folder and pulled out a stack of papers, placing them neatly on the table in front of her. "These are the deed and ownership documents for the lake. As of last week, it belongs to me." For a moment, silence. Pure, shocked silence. You could have heard a pin drop, or maybe even the sound of Margaret's blood pressure spiking. Then the room erupted. Gasps, mutters, the scrape of chairs. "He bought the lake," someone whispered loudly. "Is that even possible?" Another hissed. Margaret's face drained of color, then flushed red all over again. She picked up the papers, flipping through them as if sheer disbelief might change the ink. This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "The lake is a community asset. It belongs to the HOA." "No," I said, my tone steady, almost amused. "The lake belonged to Henry Walker. He sold it to me. The county records will confirm everything you're holding right there. The HOA never owned it. You managed it, sure. But own it, never. And now, I do." The chaos doubled. Neighbors leaned toward each other, whispering fiercely. Some grinned openly. A few looked terrified, as though I'd just announced I'd bought the moon. Margaret slammed her hand on the table. "This is outrageous. You can't just buy the lake and—" "Yes," I interrupted, leaning forward, my voice dropping just enough to make the whole room strain to hear. "I can. And I did. Which means starting today, all HOA access to the lake is revoked. Fishing, boating, picnicking, even walking around it, you're banned. Every last one of you." It was pandemonium. People shouted, some in protest, some in delight. Margaret banged her gavel furiously, the sound clattering against the noise but doing nothing to restore order. "This is illegal," she screeched. "You can't just ban an entire neighborhood from the lake." I smiled. "Check the law. Private property rights are pretty clear. And I'm the property owner. I can set whatever rules I like. And my rule is simple. No WA. No board members. No neighborhood access. You tried to fine me for fishing. Now none of you get to fish. Ever. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I saw neighbors stifling laughter, covering their mouths with their hands. Even Jim looked like he might choke on his own indignation. Margaret, however, wasn't laughing. Her hands shook as she pointed a trembling finger at me. You think this is some kind of game? You've declared war on this community. I stood up slowly, gathering my papers back into the folder. No, Margaret, you declared war the moment you taped that fine to my door. I just happened to be better at it. With that, I turned and walked out of the clubhouse, leaving the sound of chaos behind me. My heart was pounding, my blood singing with adrenaline. I hadn't just won a battle, I'd detonated a bomb. And I couldn't wait to see the fallout. Over the next few days, the neighborhood was alive with gossip. Some neighbors congratulated me quietly, slipping over to shake my hand when Margaret wasn't looking. You've got guts, one whispered. Finally someone stood up to them. Others weren't as happy. A man from 3 doors down cornered me in my driveway, demanding, "How could you do this? My kids used to play by that lake." I shrugged. Tell that to the HOA. They're the reason this happened. But the best part was Margaret. I'd see her storming around like an angry hornet, her phone glued to her ear as she barked at lawyers, county officials, anyone who would listen. She even knocked on my door once, waving a stack of papers in my face. "We'll see you in court," she snarled. "Looking forward to it," I said, shutting the door gently in her face. At night, I'd sit on my porch, sipping a beer, watching the moon reflect off my lake. The signs I'd ordered had already arrived, bold white letters on black boards that read, "Private property. No trespassing. WA members strictly prohibited." Installing them was the most satisfying afternoon of my life. Watching Margaret march up to one, read it, and nearly combust on the spot. That was the cherry on top. The WA wanted a fight. They thought they could scare me with fines and threats. Instead, I had flipped the board, turned their power into dust, and left them scrambling. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The lake wasn't just water anymore. It was leverage, it was a weapon, and as long as I owned it, the WA wasn't in charge. I was. And oh, how sweet it was. The silence after my announcement didn't last long. Within 24 hours, Margaret and her cronies had mobilized like an army with clipboards. They'd never looked so alive. Flyers appeared on mailboxes, bold, all caps accusations about me being a rogue homeowner who had stolen community property. Neighbors woke up to gossip spreading faster than wildfire. I was a thief, a con artist, a lake hoarder. My favorite was one flyer calling me a domestic terrorist with a fishing pole. It would have been insulting if it wasn't so funny. Margaret, of course, took the lead in the counterattack. She stomped around the neighborhood in her floral cardigan, clipboard clutched like a weapon, organizing emergency WA meetings and screaming into her phone loud enough for everyone to hear. "We will sue him," she bellowed one morning as I watered my lawn. "We'll take him to court and strip him of that lake if it's the last thing we do." I raised my glass of lemonade and waved. "Good luck, Margaret." She nearly choked on her outrage. But lawsuits weren't the only weapon they tried. First came the intimidation tactics. Notes taped to my door, anonymous, though the handwriting was suspiciously familiar. "You can't win against the HOA. Back down now or you'll regret it." Another said, "Your neighbors hate you. Move before it's too late." Very creative, but not exactly subtle when the notes were written on WA stationery. Then came the petty violations. My trash bin was suddenly 2 inches too far from the curb. My grass was a shade too high. They fined me for leaving my porch light on past midnight, claiming it disturbed the neighborhood ambiance. They even sent me a warning for excessive bird activity because I'd hung a feeder in my backyard. Apparently, the WA had decided that cardinals were now contraband. Every ticket, every notice, every fine, they piled them on like sandbags in a flood. And every single time, I smiled, snapped a picture, and filed it neatly in a folder I labeled evidence for the judge. Because here's the thing, when you own a lake, you don't just own water. You own power. And while the WA screamed about community rights, the law was crystal clear. Margaret might have had a gavel, but I had the county clerk, the deed, and a lawyer who thought the whole situation was hilarious. Still, the WA wasn't about to roll over. They launched a petition to reclaim the lake, knocking on doors with fake smiles and earnest voices. I saw them cornering neighbors on their porches, begging for signatures. Some caved, others laughed in their faces. A few came straight to me afterward, shaking their heads. They said you were turning the lake into a toxic waste dump, one neighbor told me, chuckling. I raised an eyebrow. Did you see any toxic waste out there? He grinned. Only toxic people. But the best part was the sneaky attempts. One night, I heard splashing at the lake. I grabbed a flashlight and walked down to the dock. There, in the moonlight, were two of Margaret's enforcers, grown men, one of them wearing khakis, of all things, trying to cast lines into the water like a couple of teenagers sneaking beer. Evening, gentlemen, I said, flicking on the light. Enjoying my lake. They froze like deer in headlights. One dropped his fishing pole straight into the water. The other stammered, we were just, checking the water quality. Of course you were, I said, pulling out my phone. Say cheese for the sheriff. They scrambled out of there so fast, one slipped in the mud and landed flat on his back. I laughed until my stomach hurt. By the next morning, Margaret was shrieking about harassment at another emergency meeting. The WA threw everything they had at me. Cease and desist letters, threats of liens, harassing calls at dinner time. At one point, they even tried to hire a security guard to patrol community property. The poor guy showed up at the lake, saw the private property signs, and called me instead of Margaret. Mr. Daniels, I think I work for you now. Not unless you like fishing, I told him. Go home before they try to pay you in expired coupons. But behind the chaos, there was something else brewing. Some neighbors, quiet ones who'd suffered under Margaret's reign of terror for years, began slipping over to my side. They didn't say it loudly, but I could see it in their eyes. Relief, hope, amusement. One by one, they started dropping by. Good for you, an older man whispered as he walked past my driveway. You're the hero this neighborhood needs, another chuckled. Even the mailman gave me a wink. Wish I could ban them from the mailbox, too, he muttered. For the first time, Margaret wasn't untouchable. Her iron grip on the WA had cracks, and the lake was the wedge splitting it apart. Of course, Margaret couldn't admit she was losing. She doubled down. She called for a vote to increase WA dues, claiming they needed emergency legal funds. That meeting was the most entertaining night of my life. Half the neighbors shouted that they wouldn't pay another dime. One woman stood up and yelled, maybe we should just let Daniels run the WA instead, at least he owns something. The room exploded in laughter. Margaret's face was redder than a stop sign. She banged her gavel so hard the head flew off and landed in someone's lap. I nearly fell out of my chair laughing. But through all the chaos, one truth was becoming crystal clear: this wasn't just about fishing anymore. It wasn't even about the lake. It was about control. Margaret had built her little empire on fear and rules and fines. And in one stroke, I had shattered it. She couldn't stand it. Not the humiliation, not the loss of authority, not the fact that for once, she wasn't the queen of the neighborhood. The backlash wasn't just desperation. It was the sound of an empire crumbling. And every petty violation, every sneaky fishing trip, every failed petition only made my victory sweeter. One evening, as the sun set over the water, I sat on the dock with a cold beer, watching the lake shimmer gold. Across the water, I could see Margaret pacing on her porch, phone pressed to her ear, still scheming, still clinging to the last scraps of her power. I raised my bottle in a silent toast. Cheers, Margaret. May your WA rest in peace. The war wasn't over yet, but for the first time, I knew exactly how it would end. Victory never arrives in a single thunderclap. It comes in ripples, waves that build until suddenly the storm breaks. For weeks, the WA threw everything at me: fines, lawsuits, petitions, even sneaky midnight fishing missions that ended with me laughing on the dock while they scrambled out of the mud. But eventually, their fury became predictable, like a child throwing the same tantrum over and over. And the more they screamed, the calmer I became. Then came the day Margaret had been promising like a prophecy: the court date. She strutted around the neighborhood in the days leading up to it, pearls gleaming, smile sharp as broken glass. We'll show him, she told anyone who would listen. The judge will hand that lake back to the community where it belongs. Her confidence almost made me feel sorry for her. Almost. The courthouse was packed that morning. Neighbors crammed the benches, whispering excitedly. Some came to watch me get destroyed. Others came to see Margaret finally get her comeuppance. I walked in wearing my best suit, holding the thick binder of evidence I'd collected. Every deed, every signed document, every ridiculous fine they'd tried to throw at me. Margaret, of course, arrived flanked by her board members like a general with her soldiers. The judge entered, stern and efficient. The case began. Margaret's lawyer launched into a passionate speech about community assets and unfair acquisition. He waved his arms, pounded the table, painted me as some kind of villain who had swooped in and stolen joy from innocent families. Margaret dabbed her eyes with a tissue at just the right moments, as if she'd practiced it in the mirror. When it was my turn, I kept it simple. I stood, walked to the podium, and placed the deed on the judge's bench. Your Honor, here's the ownership record from the county clerk's office. Here are the signed transfer papers. Here's proof of the purchase from Mr. Henry Walker, the previous owner. The HOA never owned the lake. They just acted like they did. I bought it legally, and I've followed every law since. The rest, I gestured toward Margaret's stack of complaints, is noise. The judge adjusted his glasses, flipped through the papers, and nodded slowly. It appears, he said at last, that Mr. Daniels is indeed the rightful owner of the property in question. The room gasped. Margaret shot to her feet. But Your Honor, the lake has always been for the community. It's tradition. It's tradition, the judge interrupted dryly, is not ownership. Case dismissed. The gavel came down like thunder. Just like that, it was over. The room erupted into chaos. Some neighbors cheered, others muttered angrily. Margaret collapsed back into her chair, face pale, lips trembling. For the first time, she looked small, like the power had drained right out of her. I walked past her on my way out, pausing just long enough to say, next time you want to find someone for fishing, Margaret, maybe pick a smaller pond. She glared at me, but she didn't answer. She couldn't. Her empire had crumbled in front of everyone, and no amount of pearl clutching could bring it back. After that day, the neighborhood was never the same. The HOA still existed, technically, but it was a shadow of itself. Margaret stopped patrolling with her clipboard. Jim stopped measuring grass with his ruler. The board meetings grew smaller and quieter until they fizzled out altogether. People were suddenly free to plant pink flamingos in their yards, free to hang Christmas lights until July, free to live without Margaret's constant supervision. In me, I had my lake. I turned it into my personal sanctuary. I built a sturdy dock, put up a hammock, even added a little shed where I stored fishing gear and a cooler of cold drinks. On weekends, I'd sit by the water with a line in the lake and a grin on my face, watching the sun set over the rippling surface. Sometimes, neighbors would stroll by and wave, calling out, "How's the fishing, Daniels?" I'd smile and shout back, "Perfect, for me." Of course, I couldn't resist twisting the knife a little. Right at the entrance to the dock, I posted a large, gleaming sign that read, "Private property. No fishing. No trespassing. HOA members strictly prohibited." It was poetic. The same words they'd once used against me, turned back on them in bold letters. Every time Margaret walked past, she'd glance at the sign, her face tightening like she'd bitten into a lemon. That alone was worth the price of the lake. One evening, as I sat on the dock with a beer, a neighbor joined me. He was one of the quiet ones, a man who'd never spoken up at meetings, never caused trouble. He settled into a chair beside me and watched the water for a while before speaking. "You know," he said softly, "what you did, it gave the rest of us hope. We've lived under Margaret's thumb for years, too afraid to say anything. You showed us she could be beaten. That was bigger than the lake." I nodded, taking a long sip. Funny thing is, I didn't start out wanting to beat her. I just wanted to fish in peace. He chuckled. Sometimes the biggest battles start small. The sky turned gold, then purple, then dark. The crickets sang, the water lapped gently against the dock, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. The HOA had tried to break me with rules and fines. They'd underestimated me, mocked me, threatened me. But in the end, all it took was one fishing pole, a stubborn streak, and the willingness to fight back. And as I sat there, rod in hand, beer at my side, the lake shimmering under the stars, I realized something. Sometimes the sweetest victory isn't just winning. It's knowing you'll never have to ask permission again. The HOA was finished. The lake was mine, and for the rest of my days, whenever I cast a line into that water, I'd remember the war one fought and the empire I toppled, all for the simple right to fish, and I wouldn't trade that victory for the world.